In 1984, the cause of and solution to all life's problems was alcohol. This is the story of the 1984 Schnappes Election. "1984 was a strange year in New Zealand politics. By this point in time, the National Party under Robert Muldoon had been in power for 9 years, and Robert was not an easy person to work with. Authoritarian and seldom admitting that he could be wrong, he was known to be racist, an alcoholic and suffering from diabetes. He was not a pleasant person to be around, and he often made quite rash decisions, the most famous of which was the Schnappes election of 1984, giving the Labour Party and the National Party just 1 month to prepare for a national general election. But the build-up to that was also quite fascinating, because his drinking had already shaped the way that New Zealand Parliament did things. These little differences that had been made around Parliament because of his drinking, some of them were quite insignificant, like the fact that we now have government cars because politicians don't drive themselves anywhere, especially when they're in Wellington. And this was because the party whips at the time would have to go down at night and deflate the tyres of the Prime Minister, because it's a really bad look when the Prime Minister is caught drink driving. But there's also other bigger issues that came into play, like the 1976 constitutional crisis, when he breached the 1688 Bill of Rights Act to unilaterally decide to completely wipe out the Labour Party pension plan, basically losing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of investment that workers had made. His style of politics, though, was kind of blokey. He was an everyman. He was somebody you could see yourself having a drink with, and he was the first politician on the world stage to really be like that. His influence is still felt today in that respect, and you see it in politicians like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. They were inspired in part by the way that Robert Muldoon went about doing what he did. But there were a couple of things that Robert Muldoon did not like. One of them was being put in a corner, feeling like he had no choice but to act, and he really, really hated being told what to do. And that's kind of how he felt going into the 1984 election, and that's all thanks to one MP called Marilyn Waring. So chances are, if you've ever studied gender or LGBTQ issues, or possibly even a little bit on parliamentary history, you've come across the name Marilyn Waring. At 23 years old in 1978, she was the youngest person to be elected to New Zealand's parliament at that time. She was the 14th ever woman elected to the party, and by the time she was in government, she was one of 2 female MPs national, and she was the last female MP in national to have a governmental role until 1981 when Ruth Richardson was elected. She is a very important figure when it comes to the female representation history of this country, and she was not a big fan of Muldoon on a personal level. On a policy level, they actually agreed on quite a bit around things like the need for a state welfare system, as well as making sure that the economic outlook for the country was built around the same sort of ideals that they were both happy with, which is why he made sure that she had high-ranking positions within economic committees, which shocked a lot of people. A 26-year-old in charge of the country's finances? A little bit scary. In 1984, though, she went and told leadership very specifically that she was going to be doing conscious voting on a number of issues. Those issues included things like law changes around rape and New Zealand's nuclear-free stance, which was, at the time, a pretty hot potato issue, because as far as Robert Muldoon was concerned, that was a matter of national security, and going nuclear-free was very dangerous because it would negate the ANZUS Treaty. He was not a fan. So Marilyn Waring, on a June night, went up to the leadership of the party and said, "I'm crossing the floor on this vote." Now, the National Party had a 1-person majority, which meant that there was a very good chance that they would lose that particular vote, which was obviously not something that they wanted. After a night of drinking with the Governor-General trying to work out what to do, Muldoon made a call. He didn't like being put in a corner. He made a snap decision and called a Schnappes election. Now, it's called the Schnappes election by many people. It's actually a term coined by Barry Soper, who's still working in Parliament, because of just how drunk Muldoon was. I mean, seriously, check it out. You can tell just by watching it.
So we got a date, Prime Minister?
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give him much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
Now, being so short, the 1984 campaign was actually quite an interesting one to sit down and watch, because you had Robert Muldoon, an elder statesman who was kind of blokey but had been in power for 9 years in a stagnant government that hadn't really gone anywhere, that was having a huge economic crisis at the time, versus David Lange, a young go-getter who was charismatic, who knew how to speak and wasn't showing up to events so drunk that he couldn't go out on stage and talk to people. It was short and sharp and fast, and on the night before the election, Barry Soper, who was working at Radio New Zealand at the time, actually sat down and interviewed Robert Muldoon after being ushered into his private suite in a hotel, realising he was so drunk that he couldn't even lift up the bottle that he had in his hand. He asked him a simple question: "Do you think you've won the election?" To which he replied, "Nah." Apparently, they're not 100% sure what the first answer was, because it was so drunk he couldn't really say anything. But the next day, when that news went out, he completely denied it all. Muldoon stood up on stage and says, "No, taken out of context, that's not what I said at all, makes no sense." But he lost in a landslide. The Labour Party came in, and with it, a whole bunch of societal change that we still see today coming in. That new 1984 government, with its new government smell, came in and changed a lot of things that we now take for granted as New Zealand society. They increased benefit levels, they passed the Homosexual Law Reform Act, they privatised a whole bunch of state assets. They didn't sell them off, but they privatised them. They corporatised a whole bunch of state assets so that they had to make money. It just wasn't something that people were paying for. They changed how student loans and student allowances worked. In fact, student loans weren't really a thing back then, to be fair, because it was the National Party later who introduced those. They increased limits of income for benefits, so people who were on a benefit could earn a little bit more. They increased payments for things like disability support. They made the country nuclear free. There's a lot that the 1984 Labour government did that was really impressive and really is the bedrock for the New Zealand that we have today. And all of that came down to one man who was really drunk, incredibly belligerent, and didn't like feeling as though he was being pressured into doing something. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to like, share and subscribe, where you can learn a whole bunch of other random stuff, like the time that a small town sold its name to a lingerie company, or what the mysterious mystery is behind the mystery of Mystery Creek. Otherwise, feel free to tune in and listen to some of the other stuff that we've got. Check out the vlog or some of the strange short films that people seem to be enjoying for some weird reason.